Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you for part 2 of our Resilient Leadership webinar. I'm McKenna Sturgeon. I am the Colorado Municipal League's Training and Marketing Specialist. With me today, I have some representatives from DOLA, Homeland Security, Boulder County, and the town of Lyons. We've got a really great panel prepared for you. We're very excited. So ahead of getting started, I did want to really quickly thank our partners. CCI, the Colorado Resiliency Office, and FEMA have all worked together to bring you this webinar, and we're really excited again to provide you these resources. I also want to thank our panelists for their time today. So ahead of turning this over, for anyone who is new to GoToWebinar, I just want to give you a quick rundown of our platform. To the right of your screen, you're going to see a panel. That's where you're able to ask questions. So there should be a questions drop down. Go ahead and type your question in there, and we will ask those at the end of the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Shale.
Do you want to pull up the slides, McKenna? I don't think they're showing yet. Perfect. Thank you so much. So yes, thank you to those of you who are joining us today. My name is Shale Savo. I am with the Colorado Resiliency Office. And just to get us started really quickly, for those who did not get to attend the last session or maybe have not yet seen the recording, we just wanted to give you kind of a quick overview of what we had talked about in that session. So first and foremost, we covered the top 5 things that you should have in place from a preparedness perspective to ensure that recovery goes more smoothly. And this was really looking through the emergency management lens at first, as well as through land use policy. So quickly going over the top 5 things to have in place from a preparedness perspective, looking at the emergency management lens, looking at things like written policies and written authority for emergency management, making sure that you have in writing the types of authorities that emergency management is able to do to be able to move through an event more quickly and more efficiently, and then into that recovery transition as well. Looking at things such as written agreements between jurisdictions, defining such things as mutual aid and how resources are shared, and thinking through emergency policy changes such as waivers or employee overtime considerations. And lastly, looking at procurement rules such as procuring on-call contractors for debris removal prior to an event or other types of services that may be necessary in recovery. Looking at preparedness from a land use perspective, we were talking a little bit about how to put land use and mitigation best practices into overarching plans and making sure those are interwoven throughout all of your plans so that there is consistency and that is actually at the root culture of everything that you are trying to do. Also utilizing land use best practices as a way to alleviate further cascading issues. This falls into the category of avoiding hazards, mitigating and preventing additional cascading impacts. And also is an opportunity to prepare and train for response as well as recovery and form those relationships ahead of time. And lastly, leveraging tools such as regulations and programs to help increase resiliency during recovery. So that is looking at things such as improvements in land use code following an event to help alleviate folks living in hazardous areas. Next slide, please. So as a reminder from our first webinar, and the thing that we really want to drive home, we want to emphasize that by focusing on recovery in preparedness planning, we're actually building resilience. So thinking through things ahead of time to help make that process easier after an event happens. Also, as a reminder, you do not have to go through recovery alone. So we're very intentional in asking local peers from Colorado to speak on these panels, in addition to providing tools and resources as state agencies, because we really highly encourage you to seek out your peers and learn from one another. We have a lot of really amazing local expertise, and you're only going to understand something from somebody that has been through it or walked in those shoes. And so being able to have that peer-to-peer exchange is really important and really valuable. So just a quick recap of the tools that the state has offered and has spoken to in the first webinar. DHSEM is going to go into this in a little bit more detail in their session following this one, but they mentioned planning support as well as field operations support. They have an elected officials guide. There is damage assessment support, and they also help to support coordination with state and federal agencies during the response phase and moving into recovery. At the DOLA Division of Local Government, we help to stand up disaster assistance centers. We are there to help connect folks to funding and programs. There's also regional manager support. So those are folks who have worked in local government and can understand kind of what you're going through and help support you in connecting to state resources. Continuity of government support. So if there is any kind of capacity restraints, DLG can connect you to additional support in that way, as well as general recovery. And then at the CRO, I'm going to go into a lot of these resources more in depth at the end of this webinar, but we provide a lot of educational and informational resources as it pertains to recovery and resiliency. Long-term recovery support, we have connections to peer-to-peer support networks, as well as our framework and resiliency and recovery toolkits. Next slide, please. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to our partners at DHSEM, the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, with Director Mike Willis and Jim Raymond, who is our State Recovery Officer.
All right. Thanks, Shayla. Appreciate that and appreciate the time to kind of go over some of the important things to set yourself up for success in recovery and then move through the recovery process. It is, and Jim will talk a little bit about this, and certainly Victoria is a living proof that recovery is hard. It's really hard, and it takes longer, and it costs more, and it's more frustrating than you can ever imagine. Some of the things that you can do to reduce some of those pain points, we talk about this all the time. The importance of planning ahead of time. You can plan, and I think a lot of jurisdictions don't do this, they skip this step, but putting in a lot of time and energy into recovery before the incident ever occurs really sets your community up for a more successful and more rapid recovery. Some of the things that can get worked out during that are whose responsibilities are what. What we find sometimes is a jurisdiction goes into recovery having not really talked about who does what. And then that creates friction points that just exacerbate the overall pain of recovery and pain for communities. And these partners, and you all know your partners really well, but they include things like your road and bridge, your public health, your sheriff's office, and frankly, your HR department, whoever manages your personnel policies and how they can be used during recovery. And working all of those out in your recovery plan is a good first step. It may not go according to plan, but at least you in your jurisdiction will have talked about it. After your incident, the first thing that really needs to be done well is your damage assessments. And jurisdictions, yours, you'll know where you stand on your ability to do a damage assessment, and across the state it varies widely. As Shale says, the Office of Emergency Management is prepared to assist with that. We've done quite a bit of assistance in damage assessments over the last few years to help make sure that the damages are collected and accurately portrayed to make sure that the best opportunities for the most programs, recovery programs that you're entitled to. In some cases, you'll get a state declaration, and there are state programs that we can employ to help you recover. If you're unfortunate enough to get a Stafford Act declaration, it does open a lot of programs, but it's a lot of work. And here in the Office of Emergency Management, we become your conduit to those FEMA programs, both on the public assistance side and the individual assistance side. We also help through, and Jim will talk about this a little bit more, but through the State Recovery Task Force in coordinating state department support to your recovery. That helps kind of untangle the web of state departments and who does what in your jurisdiction. We also, in many cases, depending on the complexity of the recovery, build a unified coordination group that allows some better and more organized communication between the local jurisdiction and the governor's office. So those are some of the things we bring to the immediate aftermath of an incident that may occur in your jurisdiction. State Emergency Operations Center opens, it continuously runs, but it elevates during an incident. As you see there, just since 2018, it's been at an elevated state for over 30 emergencies, several of which were pretty extended. And what we do, and you may have heard this before, but recovery starts as soon as response starts, and Jim will talk a little bit about that too. And so in the Emergency Operations Center, we keep a mind towards that, and begin setting the conditions for recovery right away, even as the response phase is still ongoing. And then Jim runs our State Recovery Task Force. This task force is organized around the recovery support functions throughout all the different state agencies. And that allows us to have a more coordinated response to your needs as you go through recovery. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the tools that we bring. And then again, I can't overemphasize how important it is to do pre-disaster recovery planning. And we are certainly available to provide some assistance in planning, technical assistance in preparing good recovery plans. So I think what I'll do now is I'll stop here and go to the next slide and turn it over to our State Recovery Officer, Jim Raymond.
Okay, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I know we've got a lot of information to cover. Recovery is it's a big topic. There's a lot to it. So really building upon everything that you've heard just in the last few minutes, I think what I'll do is walk through a few really lessons learned that I've taken away, that our whole recovery team and really all the state agencies that help in advancing recovery across the state and even some of the federal agencies have really observed. And so this is where I think we can really help just kind of discuss kind of some of the 10 things that have always risen to the surface for things that a community can do, and really regardless of size. Now, you know, the best practice is really to start looking at these things before you have a disaster. But certainly that's one of the things that we do at the State Recovery Task Force, and specifically with DHSEM's recovery section, is to help create some of these tools really at the moment that you need them. But I just want to walk through a few of these. But what I want to do is walk through just kind of some of these and just give you a quick introduction to why these things are really important. And really what we have is really building a local recovery organization is just really critical. It's something where, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what disaster is going to afflict a particular community. So really having that decision-making process in place is really critical. So that way, regardless of what the decisions are, you can get to some of those difficult decisions, which might affect funding as well. We talked a little bit about damage assessment. We really look now at disaster assessment because it really cuts across all of the different disciplines of what we call the recovery support functions. You've got to know, I guess, what's been impacted or what's broken before we can start to go ahead and fix that and return it to normal. And so really that comprehensive disaster assessment of everything from, you know, buildings, economic, housing, community, health and human services, public health, really need to take a look at that, that entire spectrum of disaster consequences and which ones are stable and which ones are going to need a little bit more help. Number 3, really identify a lead recovery manager. A lot of times that's not the emergency manager. A lot of times that's somebody who has an opportunity to really create networks in the community. They have the ability to work with budgets and you know, identify staff resources. That's really critical to identify that one person who can lead that group. Number 4, stay informed. There's an awful lot of information that comes at you during a disaster from all over the place. It's hard to sift through that information, but there's some great websites at the Department of Local Affairs, at the Department of Public Safety, and others, and we really try to capture that information into usable pieces that are going to be really helpful to you at the time. But you do have to make it, have to take a really strong approach at staying informed in what has changed during the course of the disaster in terms of what finances are available, what the disaster declarations may or may not mean, what help is available, and who's really your point of contact with the state or federal agencies. If there's cost recovery, this is a really big one. If there's a cost recovery, whether it's from FEMA, whether it's from the state or from another organization, somebody really has to be tracking that really from A to Z and make sure that they have an opportunity to really understand how all the pieces fit together. If it is a Stafford Act declaration and FEMA's involved, you'll have to have a lead organization, a lead individual who can really work with DHSEM specifically to understand the reimbursements that might be eligible. And that would include other federal agencies that might be providing, or state agencies that might be providing cost recovery. You know, tourism is definitely something that's applicable to many counties and communities across Colorado. So we can't forget that does have an impact. And that is something that has been, you know, talked about a lot during disasters, is how does that affect the community's tourism opportunities as a disaster affects Colorado. And, you know, another one that we really need to look at too is our behavioral health. Psychological first aid and just kind of that helping each other get through. It's really something we need to think about when a disaster happens, and so that we've got good resources for folks. If your community is reliant on agricultural production, as is most of the state, it's definitely something to make sure that we're connected with CSU Extension and agriculture. Number 9 on our list here is really just continue to connect with individuals. In many cases, this really can be first, right? Because our individuals are the most important thing in our communities. But this really just falls into this list where we really need to make sure that we've connected with the individuals in our community, and that if they need assistance, we can do that. You know, initially we can do that with 211 or other tools within your community, but there has to be some sort of a mechanism to get that information out. And then really the last thing that I'll mention is just our strong volunteer spirit in Colorado, and how our VOAD and our voluntary organizations really provide such an important helping hand to all of the communities in Colorado during a disaster. We almost need to start with that, as knowing that they're going to do a lot of the work for us and for the individuals and bring us back. So that's really that's really kind of my top 10 on things that we look at as far as a toolkit if we're giving an orientation to folks that are you know, looking to recover from a disaster. Work on these things ahead of time, and I really think they'll pay off. I'm going to turn it back over to Katie and see if there's anything more that there's, I'm sorry, to our facilitator, and see if there's anything more that we need to cover.
I think that was great, Jim. Thank you both so much. With that, we will go ahead and move to Katie Arrington, the Resiliency and Recovery Project Manager from Boulder County.
Hi, everybody. Oh no, can you go to the next slide? I'm worried you have the wrong slides. Okay. Can we do Victoria first? Because you have the wrong slides from me, and that is my fault.
Sure, let me move to Victoria's really quick.
Okay, sorry, Victoria. I'm going to get you the right slides. Sorry, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Victoria.
You're welcome. It's a good thing, Katie. We're both really resilient and flexible here.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. A pleasure being here, and thanks for allowing me a little opportunity to share the town of Lyons story. Not seeing who the participants are, I'm really going to be speaking from a small town perspective, And I'm going to be referencing the 2013 floods that impacted the state of Colorado. So my name is Victoria Simonson. I'm the town administrator for the town of Lyons. I've been here, hate to say it, but going on 13 years already. And so I do have to tell you that as I was preparing for this session today, seeing the news the last two mornings about Yellowstone still brings back a little PTSD for me. It has been since 2013, so it's been 9 years since our flood, but seeing those pictures, seeing houses break into the river, seeing bridges just washed away as if they weigh nothing, sure took me right back to the flood of 2013. So for any of you that are watching the news, those are definitely real pictures, and the emotions you feel are definitely what we felt during our flood here. So first of all, I want to just give people a little background about our community so that when I talk about our lessons learned, you'll put this in perspective. Hopefully some of you know where Lyons is. We are located in Boulder County, and about 40 minutes north of Denver, on your way to Rocky Mount National Park up in Estes Park. But we are located at the confluence of what are called the North and South St. Vrain Creeks. And that becomes really important here in our story because two different creeks met in the middle of our town that night. We are located in an elevation of about 5,400 square elevation height, and so that also comes into play with the velocity of the water that was involved that day. We are known for our beautiful red sandstone, our outdoor recreation, music, art, and weddings. We are a unique town in that there's only a little over 2,000 of us. 99% of our businesses are locally owned. So it's pretty much all small business except for one bank that is part of a chain. And then of course, some of you might know Lyons as Oscar Blues Brewery headquarters and Spirit Hound Distilleries. So as you can see, our environment is one that's very natural, organic, fun, healthy outdoor atmosphere. So we have less than 1,000 households here in Lyons. Next slide. But in September of 2013, a major storm front, for those of you who might not have lived here at the time, stalled out above the Rocky Mountains. And it dumped a record-breaking 17 to 18 inches of rain across our area. And we typically only get 14 inches in a whole year. So to get 18 and within 1 week was created immense saturation. Because we live in a canyon, those two rivers that meet in Lyons, I think it's something like, gosh, tens of thousands of acres of the mountains had to drain through Lyons. So the event was eventually classified by the National Weather Service as biblical in nature. Some people described it as a 500+ year event. Some described it as a 1,000-year event. But our creek flows went up to 26,000 cubic feet per second when normal flood water was 1,000 cubic feet per second. Our town was completely evacuated. All of us left for 8 weeks. We were fortunate to have only one death in our community. There were 4 in the county that night. The river did go out of its banks in the middle of the night, which also you're never prepared for when you are trying to do your planning. So if you'll keep going. We had 211 homes damaged. So if you saw at the beginning, we only have 968. So 20% of our housing was damaged or destroyed in this event. All the roads and bridges into and out of town were cut off. This is a picture in the background of one of those. The water came at such velocity that it literally ripped out the water, sewer, electric, gas, and communication lines out of the ground. So when we woke up that next morning, we had none of those services: water, sewer, electric, gas, or communications. Our town hall had been inundated with about 5 feet of water outside the building and probably 2 feet of water inside the building. Our library was completely destroyed, and our schools were uninhabitable. Our public works building, our parks, if you'll keep going, yeah. We had our public works facility was completely destroyed, if you ever see those pictures. So we had absolutely no cones, no equipment, no barricades to work with in this event. Our parks facilities, we lost all 5 miles of our trail systems. Those usually run around alongside rivers, and so they were completely destroyed. And then our community, the way the water and the river moved itself, divided our community into what we called 6 islands, so that we were totally divided and not able to be communicating with each other, except literally by standing on the edges of the roads and yelling across. So to put that into some perspective, if you'll go to the next slide, please. Our town capacity, here's a few pictures, and yeah, they do remind me of Yellowstone this morning. To put it in some perspective, when FEMA came in and did their original damage assessment, they told us that it was going to be $50 million of public assistance. Our budget, which is the next line, was $1 million. So if you can imagine, we were thinking this is going to take us 50 years of everything we have to recover from. On top of that, we only had 15 town employees. The night of the flood, there were only 3 of us who lived in town that were here to try to coordinate this situation. And so these are all things you don't think about when you are planning. You can plan really well. I thought I was pretty well prepared. I've been a city manager for a couple decades, been through my NIMS training, been through disaster training. What happened that night, though, is no access to your computer, so I couldn't access any of my flash drives. I couldn't get to town hall to get my policy manuals. I couldn't get my phone numbers. So I felt somewhat prepared. I'd been through a flood in Minnesota, so I felt somewhat prepared, but nothing had prepared me for the situation we faced here that day. So here we are 9 years later. The recovery ended up being $73 million in total funding, 64 million of that from grants, 5 million from insurance proceeds, and $4 million from HUD toward an affordable housing redevelopment. During our recovery, our staffing went from 15 people to a high of 48. And that comes into play, as Jim was telling you, how important it is to have someone identified as your recovery lead. You need people who can do the procurement. You need people who can do the financial and grant tracking. You're going to need lots more people on the ground in regard to project management, cleanup. And then this next item, there's only 4 of us that are still here from our flood. That's where Jim was talking about the psychological and emotional toll this takes on people. You will be exhausted. At about 3 months, you'll be exhausted. And to have this continue on and on for years definitely takes its toll on not only your employees, but your community as well. So we are, that should say 9 years, I don't know, it says 10 years of recovery have passed, and we have, most of our projects are completed. We are actually on our last one right now. But the disaster is not closed out. FEMA has actually only closed out 1 project so far at this point. So all this will come into play when I go through my lessons learned. You'll go to the next one. Oh, I wanted to just kind of that 64 million, I wanted to show you the diversity of projects that are involved with a disaster of our level, a federal declaration. All of our water and sewer lines, 3 miles of stream bank had to be restored. All of our parks, our public works and parks facilities. We replaced 2 full bridges plus several ped bridges. We had to very quickly learn about the federal acquisition process for people who might want to have their properties bought out instead of facing recurring claims. Recovery staffing, as you saw, it went from 15 to 48. So we are very, very thankful to the state of Colorado for helping us with our staffing over the last 8 years. 40 affordable housing units are being replaced, and of course, lots and lots of roadway repairs. It takes partners in this process, and that will be one of my lessons learned too. Mitigation and resiliency. You hear a lot about this. What I want to tell you is that as part of our recovery, we made sure that every single project had both a mitigation and a sustainability component built into it. And so things like this picture, the river had gone over the highway, and you can kind of see that in the left photo, and had taken out the highway. So when we rebuilt back our bridges, we put in a series of ponds that will break away depending on the height of the water when it comes through next time. It should create a secondary channel instead of going over the highway. So those are the sorts of things when we're talking mitigation, you want to think ahead about what could have been there that would have made our recovery less painful. Armoring our stream banks. Our stream banks are now armored. When I say that, I mean beautiful, huge blocks of stone that are both below ground about 15 feet and above ground about 10 feet that will now hold what we call a 1% flood in the next, there's a 1% chance any year that it could happen again. So we did things like that. We elevated all of our roadways and bridges. Bridges are now elevated at least 2 to 4 feet above a 1% flood chance. We elevated the homes that chose to stay. So they elevated them, but we had 29 homes that chose to elevate and stay where in town, and we had 29 who chose to be bought out by the federal government. And so we now know those homes will be safe in that 1% event. We relocated all of the water transmission lines that were close to the river to put them away from the river and under roads to try to protect them in the next event. And relocation of our public works facility out of the floodplain. And all of our parks facilities are now built, the building portions of them are built to be out of the floodplains as well. So those are some examples of mitigation, if you're wondering what that means. And then I did put, I wrote down a few lessons learned. I have so many lessons learned. It's hard to cover that in 10 minutes. But if you're listening to this thinking, okay, there's been a fire, we know there's floods, we know there's these things happening, what can I be doing? You know, the first thing is for you and your elected officials to understand your vulnerabilities. And you may just be thinking fire and flood, but there are so many more than that. There's all sorts of natural vulnerabilities in regard to winter storms and wind and other events. There's also man-made vulnerabilities that we need to be considering in this day and age, unfortunately. And then I wrote 2 words here, HIRA, which means your hazard identification risk assessment. This is a process you can go through, and right now there may be funding out there for some of these studies to be conducted. A team can come in and help you identify what is our greatest risk and what are some basic and what are some more detailed methods to deal with each of those risks. And then a hazard mitigation plan that has probably been adopted by your county. If you are a smaller jurisdiction, these are all good ways to start to educate yourself on what are our vulnerabilities other than just the obvious, especially. And then understanding the basic structure of disaster management. When you wake up at 2 in the morning to a situation like us is not the time that you want to be asking yourself, what's my role and what am I doing and what are the police doing and what is the state doing? You need to have a basic understanding of that information. Also, so that you can help with leading. People are always turning to a leader during these events, and you want to make sure that you portray confidence and knowledge to be able to help your community get through this. Mutual aid and intergovernmental agreements, again, are just critical. Lyons could not have recovered the way we did from our disaster without the partnership of the state, numerous agencies, and the federal government. It would have taken us literally hundreds of years what we were able to do in 9. Another lesson learned is this will take much longer than you anticipate. I was listening to the news this Yellowstone, and this person from Tennessee or somewhere said, when will the park reopen? And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, people don't have a clue how long it takes to re-engineer and rebuild and these projects. It will be a marathon, and you need to pace yourself, and you need to take care of yourself and your staff and your community. One of those lessons learned was managing public expectations. You really need to underpromise and overperform, because it's really hard to understand why something can take years to get repaired when they don't necessarily understand the financial aspect of this, or the amount of paperwork and grants and matching that goes into it. And then, as I said earlier, the physical, emotional, and psychological toll is very immense. I lost our whole public works department, all 6 of them, within a year of the flood. It becomes too much to bear, and the pressure and the exhaustion. And then I have one more page of lessons learned. You heard this before. Plan as much as you can, but you also have to be very flexible. You will have to change your course. So if you are one of those people that's really specific and likes to know all of what's happening, you will be very, very frustrated. You will have to punt and pivot regularly as funding streams come, as projects get denied or designs get denied, or another disaster hits in the meantime. Since our flood in 2013, the towns also had another federally declared disaster. There was a hailstorm. There's been wildfires, 3 of them within miles of us, the pandemic. So things are going to happen, and you need to know that you're going to have to be able to pivot. And then starting long-term planning early. What I mean by this is FEMA came to us 6 weeks post-flood and said, Victoria, we need to start planning your long-term recovery. And I'm like, no way, I don't even have the utilities back on yet. How are we going to do that? But they stayed very, very consistent, and they stood right next to us. And they said, we have to do it now, because as soon as you get that done, people have an expectation what's coming next. So planning early gives hope and vision and leadership for your community, and really important. And then last and very, very not least, people may not know this, recovery is reimbursement based, the federal recovery. And so you have to be able to pay for everything up front and wait to be reimbursed. This can take years. We have not been reimbursed for things that were done 8 years ago. So you have to have a way to finance your projects, how to come up with matching grant monies. You need to have someone who's watching your cash flow during recovery, because you still need to pay your staff. You still need to pay your own bills and town operations. You know, there's still elections during the events like this. There's still, you still have to plow snow. So you have to have someone watching all of these things. Making sure that your scope of work after that assessment is defined well, because if it's not, it may not be eligible for reimbursement later. Procurement, I would highly advise people hire a procurement specialist to help them through procuring work to be done. And then oftentimes with FEMA anyway, eligibility isn't determined until they close out a project. And that can be, in our case, it'll probably be close to 9 to 10 years. The people who did it are gone. We have been putting away money every year for potential clawback. So these are my major lessons learned here. I did attach, you can go to the last one. I did attach for your guidance. FEMA did 3 separate case studies on the town of Lyons and our disaster, since it was quite unusual with the whole town being evacuated for so long. And those will be in your toolkit, but there's one on housing, there's one on building your community strength, and there's one on how to leverage financing during a federal disaster. So thank you for letting me share our story. Happy to answer questions at the end.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'm going to unshare my screen really quick and pull up our next presentation. One moment. All right. Katie, this should be correct, right? Wonderful.
Okay, and you can go to the next slide just to start, because it's kind of my high level overview. All right, hi everybody. My name is Katie Arrington. I'm the Assistant Recovery Manager for Boulder County. Thanks for your patience with me submitting the wrong slides, working on too many presentations right now. But that's what disaster recovery is, flexible and adaptable. And thanks to the team for getting it up, and Victoria for going first. So these are, this is the outline of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. I will make sure that my email address is sent out with the toolkit information in case you need to follow up with anything. And then also I do slides a little bit differently. I don't put the talking points on the slides. We kind of do more image-based slides. But when you get my slides and the toolkit after, all my talking points are in the notes. All right, next slide. So how Boulder County does recovery is after the 2013 floods, which were pretty devastating to our community, just like with Lyons, we wrote and put together a recovery plan that kind of is a supplemental annex to the emergency operations plan. And in that plan, we have 3 different levels of organization charts ready to go for recovery. So we have like a small scale event affecting, less than a dozen homes, a mid-scale event, and then a large-scale event like the Marshall Fire that we experienced in December. This is how we scale up that organizational chart. And I actually included it with all the names on it so that you can see that we actually, on our org chart, we don't just have the positions, but we have the names affiliated with each position. And we also have at the bottom of the org chart, which you can't see because I cut it off, you have the contact information for me and our recovery manager, Gary Sanfason. So this is our large scale up kind of global county emergency situation. And we have this org chart preset and ready to go so that we can just fill in the boxes. And if you see those purple boxes at the bottom, they're topic specific. So we use this same org chart for COVID recovery. And during the COVID recovery, we had different boxes at the bottom. So COVID recovery didn't involve debris or parks and open space infrastructure. So those purple boxes are what's called our recovery coordination group, and those are all kind of plug and play depending on the event. Next slide. So I just want to talk about what transition to recovery looks like. Everybody else has talked about it a lot, so I'm not going to go through it very much. But basically, the incident recurs and recovery starts, and then goes weeks to months to years. And there's kind of my presentation is the short to mid to long, so you can kind of follow along with how the slides go. But this is the general recovery cycle that a lot of us who do recovery work use. So first off, I want to talk about language access, and that's something we prioritize both in response and recovery. And for us, language access doesn't just mean bilingual translations, it also means language access for residents who may be deaf or hard of hearing, or may need other technical language skills. So assessing what languages your community speaks right away other than English. How is my messaging prioritized to multiple languages from the beginning? So not as an afterthought, but as the normal operating way of doing things. Having live interpretation at town halls. If you haven't had a town hall on Zoom before, Zoom has a live interpretation function that if you have an interpreter, residents can see the presentation in Spanish simultaneously with the English translator. So if that's something that you think your community would want to do, I'd be happy to show you how we do that in Boulder County. That's been a really effective tool for especially the Marshall Fire recovery. Closed captioning, and then we also have, we hired for this Marshall Fire recovery, we also hired a half-time translator for Spanish English translations, so that all our press releases, all our website, everything could go immediately up in Spanish and English. So that's just a contract position. All right, next slide. And Mike talked about this. You'd think our presentations were synced up, but we all have the kind of the 10 best practices for disaster recovery, even if they're in different orders. But damage assessment and the DAC. So two just separate things, but they kind of go together. They happen simultaneously. Our damage assessment team in Boulder County is multi-departmental. It includes teams from assessor, treasurer, community planning and permitting, which is our land use department. And there's a separate damage assessment annex of the county recovery plan. So everybody knows what to do and how to deploy in a situation where we need to do large damage assessments. And then this is a picture of our disaster assistance center from the Marshall Fire. We repurposed a county building that was empty and due to be under construction. So it was just kind of an empty warehouse space. And we set up a disaster assistance center to be a one-stop shop for all residents. It's a little bit, we provide more services than some traditional disaster assistance center. We had volunteer groups, we had daycare, we had food regularly, Red Cross, FEMA, kind of a one-stop shop for those residents immediately following a disaster to try to meet the needs of the community. Additionally, a best practice that we have done since the floods is community town halls. Post-flood, and ideally, these community town halls are located in the community in person. I think that gives a more personal feel. It gives some humanness to being a government employee who's relating in person and spending time with the residents. But COVID has necessitated virtual options. We put all our town halls up on our website after they happen, so they're all recorded. And we also have a way to allow for questions and answers that doesn't disrupt the whole flow. So we kind of field the questions and answer them behind the screens, much like this GoToWebinar will do. But those community town halls, especially early on, even if you don't have a lot of answers, residents are looking for assurance, guidance, or that you're finding the answers. So our first community town hall involved subject matter experts from almost all of our departments, all saying, we don't know the answers to your questions, but we're working on it. Here's where the website will be. Here's the small answers we do know. So sometimes having a community town hall, even when you don't have all the information you want to present, is better than waiting weeks and weeks to have that town hall. We also do kind of the personal level that Mike talked about on his top 10 about how to outreach to impacted residents. How do we meet the residents where they're at? We usually find a neighborhood gatekeeper. We figure that out either through someone we already know, someone comes to the forefront, we post on Nextdoor. We use pre-existing cultural brokers for neighborhoods where there may be distrust of local government. In the case of the Marshall Fire, there was also a severe wind event, and a lot of the mobile home community was damaged during the wind event. And our mobile home, the specific mobile home communities that were impacted have a big distrust of government for a lot of valid reasons. So we did some on the ground cultural brokering work. We're always working on building existing relationships. We try to meet in the impacted neighborhood. Right now, my office, the Recovery and Resiliency Division for Boulder County, has a weekly meeting with unincorporated Boulder County residents to talk about all the high-level recovery needs. We answer questions. We don't go into those meetings with pre-set agendas. We just go there for listening and question answering, and kind of just meet the community where they're at. And we can have a pre-identified idea of what needs they have, but almost always the community needs are different or additional to what we would have thought in the first place. For Marshall Fire, we developed a partnership with Community Foundation, who raised tons of millions of dollars for Marshall Fire to think about disaster case management in a different way. Traditionally, disaster case management is funded by FEMA, and sometimes takes a long time to set up, and there's sometimes there's restrictions. A lot of the disaster case management, as it should be, is geared towards low to moderate income families, which in the case of the Marshall Fire was not the huge proportion of impacted residents. But because we have a 75% or more underinsurance rate, just because they aren't LMI households doesn't mean the disaster wasn't devastating. So we figured out a way to provide traditional case management service and kind of higher touch point recovery navigation, so that someone could come in and is just feeling overwhelmed by all the information, and a recovery navigator will meet with you once and talk through your recovery plan and help you develop it, and maybe you don't need to come back for the traditional case management services. This recovery navigation program is being set up right now, but we're really excited because it's set up within the first 6 months post-disaster, and disaster case management services often take a lot longer to set up, and it's going to be a one-stop shop for residents to access rebuilding funding, some of the green rebuilding funding, unmet needs funding, and to offer reassurance. So there'll be long-term residents going through that, and then people that just need the one touch. Okay, next slide. Keep in touch with your local partners. I know I'm running short on time, but basically local partners at all levels of government are super important. We call on them all the time. Next slide. This is really critical. You early on need to define what your county will and will not do. With staff that are reassigned to the disaster, some of their work needs to be taken off that plate. That seems common sense, but it often doesn't happen. And it means that as a local government or other entity, you may have to decide to not do some of your normal services, and it result in the performance, in the support of the disaster recovery. So there may be things your jurisdiction cannot do while disaster recovery is happening. Having those conversations very early on, or having those conversations ahead of time and having some of the things your county will and will not do in a disaster laid out in your recovery plan can be really helpful. Next slide. Dale Place, our community planning and permitting director, was on last week, and he talked about this a little bit, but we have a addendum in our land use code called Article 19, which basically is a section of the land use code that addresses the needs of a specific disaster and can flex to that disaster's need. It's adopted pretty quickly. It's customizable to the disaster scope and needs. And if your jurisdiction is interested in what that looks like, I can get you connected with the right people. And then finally, last slide, our Recovery and Resiliency Division, our priority is advocating for residents. It has to come at all levels. It has to, you have to have easy to find contact information, accessible staff people, open office hours, be responsive if you say you're going to be responsive. And in some cases, you may be the initial case management ear while disaster case management is set up. All right, thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. Shale, I'm just gonna pull your slides up for you really quick.
Great. And so as McKenna's pulling those slides up, thank you so much, Katie. That was such a great in-depth overview. I'm just going to kind of round us out with the tools that the CRO offers to help with recovery and resiliency for your jurisdiction. We might be a little bit over time today, so if you have questions, we'll hang out for a little bit, but if you have to drop off, that's totally fine, and we can follow up later. So just jumping quickly into this, if you want to go to the next slide. So a couple of the tools that we offer to help folks move through recovery into resiliency include our peer exchanges. So it's helpful to navigate a situation when someone else has already experienced it, as I kind of mentioned earlier. And so the CRO facilitates peer exchanges. We currently have 2 of them right now. So one is on COVID recovery and one is on wildfire recovery. And this is where impacted communities can come together to help troubleshoot challenges, share ideas, capitalize on lessons learned, and just support one another. It helps to lean on one another as we go through these types of events, especially large scale ones. Next, we have our recovery toolkit. This is a step-by-step guide that walks local governments through the aftermath of a disaster and looks at key timeframes as well as activities that go with those timeframes that are important to help ensure a successful recovery. Our Planning for Hazards guide, which is looking at land use solutions for Colorado. So we did mention this one in the first webinar as well. And this is a guide that serves as a resource to help support local governments and looking at addressing hazards using land use tools and best practices before and after disasters to help alleviate risk and cascading impacts. So speaking a lot to the mitigation that Katie and Victoria both mentioned earlier. One thing that we definitely want to make sure that folks know about is the local funding guide that is offered through DOLA. So this is a resource that was stood up to help local governments navigate unprecedented funding sources. So looking at things like the funding that's available through the American Rescue Plan Act, as well as the IIJA, which is the Infrastructure and Improvements Job Act. So looking at funding like that, as well as other types of recovery and resiliency related funding offered through the state government as well. And so this funding is obviously available to help local governments in addressing challenges caused by these large scale disruptions. And that is going to be updated frequently. And then another resource I want to make sure that folks are aware of is the Colorado Local Guide to Recovery. So while this was not necessarily developed by the CRO, it was we were a partner in it. And this is a resource that was developed by locals for locals. So it was originally crafted by the Colorado Resiliency and Recovery Collaborative, which is a lot of members who are folks who live locally in Colorado that have been through large events, particularly the 2013 flood. And it is a resource to help local governments move through recovery, and similar to our toolkit, provides kind of step-by-step instructions and lessons learned on how you can do that. So with that, we will go ahead and turn it over to McKenna again to go through any questions that you all might have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you again to all our great speakers. I'm just going to jump right into it really quickly. The first question asks, how do you manage cash flow for communities already struggling prior to a disaster when they keep getting hit with additional disasters? And this is Denise from Weld. I'm working with our communities trying to pre-plan for high-ranking hazards. And that's for anyone. Victoria, it looks like you have a response.
Sure. You know, there's a myriad of different financial resources out there. Some of them are probably you're not necessarily familiar with them. I would guess that the guides that Shale referred to have some options in them as well. In a small community, we were very, very fortunate that Department of Local Affairs helped us with, and the state Department of Homeland Security Emergency Management. They gave us advance funds because we thought we were doing good. We had three times our general fund in reserves. That was gone like in the first month. So we were fortunate to get an advance funding from the state, and then we pay them back as we get reimbursed by FEMA. That'd be one alternative for maybe the smaller communities.
Awesome. Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add? Perfect. So it looks like we've got one more question. Do municipalities have access to county resources like interpreters?
If Director Willis is still on, I think that would be a great question for you all with the AFN resources that might be available to local communities. If not, I can speak to them a little bit. So DHSEM offers some support through their Access and Functional Needs program. While I can't speak to what exactly the process looks like for interpreters, that is something you could reach out to Sadie Martinez, so we can make sure to include her contact information in the takeaway document. But they might be able to help connect you to local interpreters or folks that are available through state resource requests to be able to bring in that kind of a resource for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It looks like those are all the questions we have right now. I'll go ahead and, as I wrap up, put everyone's contact information on the screen and share myself so you all know who's talking. Thank you everyone for attending our webinar this afternoon. I did want to just give one more quick shout out to our panelists for their time. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And then thank you to our partners as well, CRO, FEMA, and CCI. Thank you for working with us on this. This has been great. I will be sending out a link with this recorded webinar as well as the presentation materials and resources for you as well. So keep an eye out for that. It'll be coming later this week. Please feel free to reach out with any follow-up questions as well. I'm happy to put you in contact with the right resource or find you those. So with that, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.